trouble setting the. Thank you for the reminder to record. So, we've got two excellent speakers. Zarina has been working on these issues for over 10 years. Ruth has worked extensively on climate justice and how the co-benefits of work on climate change work with deprived and excluded communities. And Ruth will be able to tell you more about that.
Stop it.
Can I ask everyone to mute themselves, please? We have got 40-something people on the call. If you've got comments, please do use the chat box. And if you got questions for either speaker, please do put them in the chat box with a kind of cue or a question at the start so that they're easily identifiable. We are intending to have a short discussion session in small groups so that everyone can have a chance to reflect on and discuss what we've heard. But without further ado, I'm going to introduce Zarina Ahmad, who has been heavily involved through the council, CEMVO. I can't even remember the initials of CEMVO. I'll invite Zarina to do it herself. But the presentation I heard from Zarina was really inspiring a while ago. So I hope she will interest and inspire us all to think seriously about how we can make climate action in Oxfordshire and across the country, of course, much more diverse and representative of all our communities. Zarina.
Thank you, Chris, and thank you for inviting me along today. So my talk's going to be quite informal, so it's just going to be more of a chat, talking about my journey, talking about what I do and why I do it, and then talking a little bit about the impacts and then connecting it to climate justice and how it relates to climate justice, how it can help in terms of looking at diversifying COP, but also really showing how to make the global connection to other parts of the world, which is quite important. And I think that sometimes gets forgotten that we have a huge resource within the UK to other parts of the world. Right, so like Chris said, so I'm Zarina. My journey started probably about 12 years ago. At that point, was going through a divorce. And I was looking to see who I was, right? So that's where it started from. So what that means is that I actually reassessed my life and I thought, well, what is it that I want to do? What was it that I left school, university to do? And there was two things I was passionate about, right? So my degree was in psychology. So I was always passionate about working with children and working with people, understanding behavior. And then my second passion was environment, was looking after the planet and saving the world. So I was one of these children when I was very young that used to go around saying, I want to save the world. So watching like Miss Universe saying the words, I want to save the world, wasn't superficial for me. It actually meant a lot. So those were my two passions. So I did a little bit of looking at the pros and cons, thinking about, well, where can I invest my time? What can I do? What do I need to do to either follow a career in one or the other? And then, fortunately, the environment worked. That was the one that kind of on the scales was more higher, and that was more easier for me to go into. I didn't need to reskill myself. I didn't need to get further education. I didn't need to invest any money into it. So that was how my journey actually started, looking at working in the environment. I started working in a small community in a rural area in East Ayrshire on a climate change funded project. So I was doing, looking at energy efficiency, fuel poverty, looking at community gardening, community asset buyouts, all of these issues in a very rural area, which had low aspirations, high unemployment, high deprivation, all of these social justice issues were prevalent in this area. And it was hard work when talking about climate change in an area like this. But you learn to become creative. You learn to understand people from their starting points and having those discussions. Right. However, right, so this was in a very white, predominantly white area. And At this point, naively, I thought we had moved away from a world where racism existed, right? I had grown up in the 70s where racism was very overt, right? It was okay to be called a packy. It was okay to say the nigger word. It was okay to say go back home. It was okay to be beaten up for being somebody of color, right? So that was what I grew up with. So coming like now into like the 2000s, it was like, these things don't exist. We've got zero tolerance, right? So racism doesn't exist. My children aren't going to face racism like I faced racism. So that's okay. So for me, that was okay, right? However, an incident happened, and it happened with a member of the Green Party. So I'd gone along to a hustings, and at this hustings, I was so looking forward to meeting this delegate from the Green Party, this representative that was going to be on the same wavelength as me, had the same ethos, had the same principles, believed in equality, believed in justice, believed in fairness. All of these issues that the Green Party really talk about much more than any other party, any other political party. So I'd gone along to this hustings, and it was in Glasgow, so a little bit further away from rural Ayrshire. And when I went into the room, and as I walked in, the gentleman from the Green Party looked over at me, and I thought, oh, does he recognise me from the work I've been doing in East Ayrshire? Because we've been kind of doing some excellent work in East Ayrshire around procurement and working with food producers and the local council. So I thought maybe he's heard about some of that work that we've been doing there. And then I sat on his table, and he looked right over at me, and I got all excited, thinking, little old me from East Ayrshire, he's actually going to speak to me. So I was like, oh, this is getting exciting, you know. And he opens his mouth, and he directly then speaks to me. So I'm all excited that this person that I've like held up on a pedestal is now going to speak to me. He turns around and he says, your kind don't grow, do they? Right. So at that moment, 101 permutations were going on in my head by, well, what does he mean by your kind? First and foremost, for me, was being a woman, right? So does he mean because I'm a woman, women don't grow? And I'm thinking, can't be that. And then I'm thinking, well, it can't be because I'm from East Ayrshire, because East Ayrshire is just full of farms. So it can't be that. Then I'm thinking, oh, he's heard me speak, and he knows that I'm not from Scotland and I'm from the northeast of England. But I'm thinking, can't be that either, right? And then it was only when the rest of the room went into this deadly silence, it's like, silence, that I realized he was talking about the color of my skin. And then I turned around and looked at him and said, pardon. And he repeated it again, but in a much more slower way, as if I hadn't understood what he said, right? So it was that point that everything turned for me in terms of working in the environmental sector and thinking about race equality, because I thought as there is so much work still to be done when we've got people in leadership that still think like this. So I was fortunate enough then to join a race equality organisation, which is called CEMVO, which stands for the Council of Ethnic Minority Voluntary Organisations, which is an intermediary with Scottish Government. And basically that means they're like the middleman for Scottish Government and communities. So when there's issues within the community, the ethnic minority communities within Scotland, they can be brought up to Scottish Government, and vice versa. If Scottish Government have any policies or strategies that they want to engage with the ethnic minority sector, then they come to an organisation like CEMVO. Now, I just want to take a wee stop there in the story, because I want to do a little bit of definition around BME, BAME, BAME, EM, and people of colour, right? Because that gets confusing for a lot of people. So the terminology BAME, Black and Asian minority ethnic, is used in UK, especially in government and policy making, right? The term BME, Black minority ethnic, is used by Scottish Government and Scottish NGOs and Scottish policymakers, right? EM tends to be used by some of the race equality organisations because it includes all ethnicities that are a minority, and that can also include white ethnicities, for example, Romanians and Gypsies. Right, okay. Somebody said that they can't hear me. Do you want me to get a bit closer? Does that help? Is that okay? Right, okay. So, and then there's people of colour. And again, some of the race equality organisations that work within the sector tend not to use people of colour because, again, they would not be working with people that are white minorities. So it depends on who the organisation is, depends on which policy and government that you're under, that you tend to use different acronyms. Okay, so I'm going to use intermittently probably EM, ethnic minorities, and BME because I'm based in Scotland, just for clarification. Right, okay, so back to the story. Right, so at this point, so I was working for CEMVO, and the first thing that came up was going to Scottish Government, having a look at their Climate Challenge Fund, which helps communities to take action on climate change. Right, so fortunate, this is an exceptional time, because most of the time when we go to Scottish Government and ask for stats and data, right, it's never available, right? They've not collected stats and data on working with BME communities, right? And in this case, they had just done a review on the Climate Challenge Fund. So this was back in 2012. They'd done a review on the Climate Challenge Fund, and there was gaps of who they were engaging with. Now, when they say gaps, so there was gaps on marginalised communities, and marginalised communities included the BME sector. And that was the part that we were interested in, right? And at this point, Scottish Government had said, people from BME communities, so BME organisations, aren't applying for the funds because they're not interested in climate change. Now, for me, that was a red rag to a bull, because I'm thinking, I'm somebody from an ethnic community, and I'm very much interested in climate change and have been working on climate change for the last couple of years by this time. And I'm thinking, so I can't be the only person of colour or from an ethnic background that's interested in climate change. That just sounds ridiculous, right? So we said to them, well, how do you know this? And they said, well, we've had the fund out since 2008, and we've only had 3 projects that have applied for the funding. So it just shows that they have other priorities. Now, this is another term that is used again and again when working with ethnic minorities, that they have other priorities. So they're hard to reach, they have other priorities, right? So we then held a conference inviting over 100 organisations from the EM sector to come along. And what the result of that conference was that many of these organisations, I think all of them, had not heard of the Climate Challenge Fund. And if they had, they may have been interested in applying for the funding. So we worked with Scottish Government then to embed targeted equality outcomes into their tender documents for the CCF, the Climate Challenge Fund. So whoever was administering the funding for Scottish Government had to ensure they were going to meet this quota of working with people from BME communities. So that was how my journey started, with working with ethnic minorities and the environment. So that was how we started to link the two together. So from 2013, we started working in partnership with Keep Scotland Beautiful, who administer the funding, the Climate Challenge Fund for Scottish Government. And the result from that was now, what's that, 2013 to 2021, like 7-8 years later, we've had over 150 projects across Scotland from BME communities taking action on climate change, right? So what does that really mean in terms of what has it meant for the sector, and what has it meant for the environmental sector? So when I say the sector, the BME sector. So for the BME sector, it's meant that there's been over £15 million being awarded to the sector that would not have got it. So again, thinking about climate justice, right? So this sector would not have been included in any conversations around climate justice, any policy making, any decision making, if we hadn't done the work we did. So it gave the resources for communities to have those, to have those conversations, to have someone in staff, to work with volunteers, to start actually taking action around things like energy, transport, food, and recycling and waste. And some of these projects have become really, really successful and have had funding year after year. And other projects have started to dabble in it. And unfortunately, with the way the funding is, it's like a yearly cycle. So it's not, and it's very competitive. So not all the projects will get refunded. So we've had a lot of staff that have been upskilled. We've had new staff put into place. And for a lot of these organisations, it's been the lifeline for some of these organisations where they wouldn't have. There was an organisation called The Welcoming, who at one point was about to close shop. And because they managed to get the funding, we worked really hard with them to get the funding. They are now thriving as an organisation, as a charity organisation. So they're doing many more projects and not just the climate change project that they were funded for. And there's similar stories similar to the Welcoming Association. For some of the other charity organisations, it's been the backbone of what they do, right? So they've moved from being a race equality organisation to actually becoming an environmental organisation. And that's been a wonderful shift for me to see that bit that has happened. So that was that bit of work. And then for the environmental sector, what it's meant is that now there's a way to engage with communities that were classified as hard to reach, right? And we did this because, how we did this was we set up the Ethnic Minority Environmental Network. So behind the CCF projects, the success of a CCF project is by looking at the outcomes of what they've achieved, right? However, for me, a project is not successful just by meeting the outcomes. It's about the people who are behind the project, who are delivering the project, who are passionate about the project. They make a project successful. So when we've got all these people, well, once the project finishes, where do they go? What do they do next? For me, I didn't want to lose my alliance, my co-companions, my colleagues. And I didn't want to be the only voice that was going to be sitting in stakeholder groups and representing the BME communities, because within BME communities, there's diversity within diversity, right? So this is why we set up the Ethnic Minority Environmental Network, so that we could have, it could be very clear that there is diversity within diversity. There are many voices. It's not just me who is out there spearheading the CCF work or working on environmental issues, but we've got a whole team of us. So that was why the Ethnic Minority Environmental Network was set up. And again, through that, we've did a lot of work with people like Scottish Wildlife Trust, Scottish National Heritage, which is Nature Scotland now, Forestry Commission, many Friends of the Earth Scotland. So through this, what we did was then look at engagement strategies. We looked at communication strategies. We looked at staff representation and board representation, and funding streams and resources, and how resources are shared. And a lot of the work we did a lot of collaborative work. So partnership work is really important, because when you do partnership and collaborative work, it's really about sharing the resources and being on the same page rather than doing to somebody. You're actually doing with them. And that's a huge big difference when you start working. If you start changing that paradigm and that mindset to not doing to an organization or a community, but start working with them, things change. And that's where the magic can happen. So that's what we've been doing. But there is still a lot of challenges. And the challenges are that working with ethnic minority groups and organisations, they're still seen as being the underdogs, right? So in Scotland, the BME communities came together to host the Climate Festival year after year. However, they never get recognised as being the ones that are leading the climate festivals. They're still seen as the underdogs, even though they're doing excellent work and spearheading a lot of work. And that, for me, is a real challenge. The second challenge is reports, research. There's a lack of that when it comes to BME communities. And that's where the next part of my journey is starting, because I'm actually now doing a PhD looking at sustainability behaviours and attitudes from the migrant communities. And the reason for this is because what I learned working with BME communities was that climate change was real for many of them. They had links across the world, right, where people had suffered from climate change, their families, their homelands. And so climate change was real. They might not have the jargon or the language that we use in the West to describe what's happening, but for them it was real. And the second thing was there's a lot of inherited sustainable behaviours that don't get included in mainstream narrative in the green agenda, right? And doesn't get valued of what they do. And then the third thing is, because of colonialism, a lot of these behaviours have been like bashed out of them because they've been seen as being uncivilized and not progressive. For instance, like using a cycle, right? So from people from the Indian continent, cycling was very, very common. However, because of this idea of Western progression and capitalism, having a car and having ownership of a car is much more, is the place that people want to aspire to be. So culturally, there's a lot of conflicts that happen internal, and it's sometimes a difficult place to navigate. And that again brings me to the issue of like climate justice. So thinking about climate justice is very much about who's getting impacted. Yes, and it's not just about the global south, but even within the UK, we've seen because of the pandemic that people from marginalised and BME communities are the ones that have suffered the most. And again, in a climate crisis, they'll be the same ones that are suffering again in the UK. But they're also the same ones that don't have a voice to be heard at a political level or have a platform for their voices to be heard. So I think those are, for me, there's still a lot of work to be done in those two areas. So thank you for listening.
Well, thank you very much, Zarina, for some really interesting personal background, as well as outlining the key issues. And I think that issue about communities somehow having other priorities, I don't know how many times down the years I've heard that one, and it's still being said, which is depressing. But we're going to move straight on to the next speaker, who is Ruth Mayne. Ruth, I'm sure, will be known to quite a lot of people around Oxford as one of the founders of Low Carbon West Oxford a good few years ago. But Ruth's work on the co-benefits of tackling climate change, the fact that it helps with so many other issues, has been really important. And she's been working with Oxfam on their global climate and how that ties in to local work. So I'm very pleased that we've got Ruth to follow on from Zarina. Over to you, Ruth.
Thanks, Chris, and thanks, Zarina. Yeah, great to be here. I'm going to say a few words about climate justice, why it's important, what it means practically, and then zoom down onto what is happening locally and on the issue and what more we can do. I guess most of us are here today because we recognise the need for an urgent and fast transition to a zero carbon future if we were to avert climate catastrophe. But it's also important that that transition is just as well as fast. A just transition isn't just a nice add-on, it is actually a practical and strategic necessity, because we won't get a fast transition unless it's also fair. We know that just unjust policies and programs generate resistance, protests and backlash. We only have to think about the Gilets jaunes protests in France about fuel price increases, or the public disquiet about green levies on fuel bills in Britain. And some indigenous communities around the world are resisting renewable energy projects because of unjust land grabs. So conversely, if we can achieve a just transition, it can help actually create a much more inclusive and prosperous as well as green future, which will increase public support for a fast transition and help speed it. There are, of course, also powerful moral reasons for a just transition. One of the most important, as Zarina mentioned, is that those who contributed the least to the climate crisis can often suffer its worst impacts. At intergenerational level, that may include young people. At international level, that can include millions of people in lower income countries who have carbon footprints a fraction of ours. And then on a national level, within countries, it can often include... Okay, someone turn off there. Thank you. It can often include marginalised communities, Black, Indigenous and people of colour and women. But additionally, a sometimes neglected fact is that actually a just transition is actually legally required. The principles of a just transition are embedded in various UN climate change, environmental and human rights conventions and domestic laws. But so what does climate justice mean in practice? I want to just highlight a few key principles and features of a just transition as I understand it. First, a key principle is that those most responsible for the climate crisis, the big emitting countries, fossil fuel companies, wealthy individuals, should reduce their emissions the fastest and furthest, and also provide compensation to those suffering its impacts. A few illustrative reasons. Historically, wealthy countries are responsible for around 79% of emissions from 1850 onwards. 100 companies are responsible for more than 70% of the world's emissions. And in the UK, it's been estimated that someone in the wealthiest 1% of people will produce 11 times the amount of carbon emissions of someone in the poorest half of the population. A second and related principle of climate justice is that those with the most resources and capacity should shoulder the greatest costs of the transition. Another, sometimes overlooked but important principle of a just transition is that the benefits of climate action should be fairly distributed. And there is now a big body of evidence showing that the value of the co-benefits of climate action, improved health, new jobs, well-being, biodiversity, new markets, are significant and will greatly outweigh the investment costs if we act now. So globally, for example, the green economy is estimated to be worth something around £26 trillion of new markets, set to create an estimated 65 million new green jobs. In Oxfordshire, a 2014 report showed that the green economy was estimated to be £1.15 billion a year and was already employing around 9,000 people. Additionally, there's a strong growing body of evidence about how climate action can help save lives and improve the health and well-being of millions of people due to cleaner air, improved diets, healthier homes, and active transport. And there are multiple other social and economic co-benefits, for example, the provision of clean and affordable public transport and energy, and the like. So because of the scale of these co-benefits, it's important that carbon reduction policies and programs don't just focus on reducing the emissions from the biggest emitters, that's crucial, but they're also designed to be inclusive and share that they are designed to be inclusive. So they share the benefits with lower income and marginalized groups, even if they're lower emitters. If the transition can achieve that, then it will simultaneously help reduce poverty and inequality, which is the logic behind approaches such as the Green Deal, Build Back Better, the Just and Green Recovery. If it doesn't, the co-benefits are likely to be captured by big, wealthy and powerful institutions and emitters, exacerbating our existing inequalities. But critically, a just transition also means an important principle of a just transition is ensuring that affected communities can participate in decision making. And that's crucial in its own right, but it's also because their involvement actually ensures more effective and equitable design of policies and programs. You know, their expertise is needed. And finally, a just transition should protect people's rights. For example, preventing people workers in the old fossil fuel economy being thrown out of work with no social protection or retraining, and preventing injustices in the new green economy, such as the land grabs I mentioned. So the COP provides us with an important opportunity to mobilise, campaign and help achieve both a just and fast transition. At international level, as people mentioned in the morning, the movements around the world will be campaigning to get the biggest emitting countries to reduce their emissions the fastest and furthest, but also to provide finance to vulnerable countries and communities on the front line of the climate crisis. Nationally, within the UK, we need to get the UK government to commit to and implement ambitious carbon reduction targets. But we live in a country with highly unequal distribution of wealth and power, where many people are reeling from the economic impacts of the pandemic and have suffered decades of austerity, low wages and insecure jobs. So we also need the government to commit to achieving a just transition. And then at local level, there's much we can and should do to promote a fast and fair transition. And we are definitely making positive progress. And I just want to mention a few initiatives that are happening, which may be familiar to many of you, but for example, the City Council leads the Zero Carbon Network, which is an initiative which brings together the city's biggest emitting institutions to cut emissions, public sector, private sector, and civil society. Locally, we've also seen some investment in green electric buses, which is really important as some people can't afford to travel by train or by a car. And so obviously green public transport provides vital co-benefits in terms of access to jobs and services. We can see councils and housing associations are retrofitting and putting solar PV on social housing to enable low-income households to save energy and money and capture the health benefits of warmer homes while also creating local jobs. And we have the Low Carbon Hub, helping schools and community buildings generate clean energy, create income streams and for local people. We also have a campaign for a living wage, which is important to ensure people on low incomes can afford to live and live sustainably. And in terms of participation in decision making, Oxford City Council held one of the first, local citizens' assemblies on climate change, which involved a representative group of people. But we need to significantly increase the pace, scale and scope of climate action. One way of doing this is to join campaigns to press the government to introduce much stronger, more inclusive government policy and increased investment on a range of areas: home retrofitting, fuel poverty, planning regs for new housing, green and affordable public transport. We could go on. But there's also much more we can and could do at local level. I'm not going to focus on that because there's in the interest of time, but I'm just going to focus on one of the strategic things we can do, which is the focus of today in a way, and then that's to help widen participation in the local climate movement and decision making. And as I've said, that's important both for helping ensure that information resources co-benefits are shared fairly. I mean, Zarina illustrated the effects of that, of what happens when that doesn't happen. People are simply excluded. And it will help increase the number of people taking action. It will help ensure more effective and equitable design of local carbon reduction initiatives. And it can help build greater public support for a fast transition. So, I mean, the Black Lives Movement and feminist movements have greatly increased awareness of the links between racial and gender justice and the climate crisis. So there's now much greater understanding and receptivity about these issues. Well, or if not greater, but there is much greater, that is greater, at least I do find that. And the COP also offers us an opportunity to mobilise and widen engagement. Zarina mentioned some of the ways in which that she has managed to widen engagement, involve people, get people involved. Some of the suggestions from my experience are similarly getting out to communities and people where they live. Don't assume they're not interested. Actively listening and learning from people about solutions, what works. Making space for and passing the mic to people whose voices aren't being heard, finding the overlap and synergies between climate change and other social and economic issues. As Zarina said, around food, transport, waste, recycling, and ensuring greater representativity in our boards, committees, staffing, upstream, volunteers upstream. And I think, yeah, sure you will all have many other ideas. So to conclude, climate justice means both taking urgent action now to prevent the worst impacts of the climate emergency, but also doing it so in a way that reduces rather than exacerbates existing poverty and inequalities and helps build a radically better future. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Ruth. That was some really important points there. And yeah, I think you're absolutely right. Being better listeners is something a lot of climate groups really need to think about. What do the people we want to engage with us about? We got a few minutes of questions. Then I'm going to ask you to just go into groups for about 10 minutes, just to think about 2 or 3 points, which are, sorry, this is, yeah. What I'm going to ask each group to think about is, what can my group or organization do to help create a fairer and more diverse climate action movement? What can we do together to achieve this? And also, what support would we need or like to make this happen? But let's take a few questions first, if people have got them, or you may just want to talk. Any questions or points? I haven't seen anything in the chat, but that doesn't mean that they aren't out there. Sorry, I've got a slight loss of, okay.
Chris, hi,
Yeah.
Philippa here. Yeah, just wanted to say, so yes, I'm Philippa Hoy. I work with environmental charity Bioregional. And I just wanted to talk about a project that we, together with Aspire, have been running for the last 6 months to try and get more inclusion in the sustainability action in Oxfordshire. And this is using the One Planet Living framework that I was speaking about this morning. So we've trained up what we're calling One Planet Living community champions. And we've really been trying to get into sort of disadvantaged and ethnic minority communities to help them create their own plan that's tailored for them, for their needs. And it's taking a little while to get into those communities, but Michelle, who's also on the call this afternoon, has been making good progress contacting, for example, refugee groups and asylum welcome. But we are finding it difficult, and if anybody has ideas of how we can connect better, we've tried to involve, for example, Oxford Community Action in our steering group for the project. So we're hoping that they will help, get us into different communities. But so we're making progress, but it's not as good as we'd like. So if anybody has ideas of how we can make those initial contacts and talk to people, explain what we're trying to do, and hopefully get them to want to get involved and create action in their own particular neighbourhoods that works for them. So if everyone could take that idea into the different rooms, that would be great.
Okay, one more question. Sally XR, I think you got your hand up.
Hi, yeah, I think it's probably more of a question for Ruth. Just thinking about the sort of just transition issues and sort of, I'm kind of linking it back to the earlier conversation that happened in the Green New Movement group and issues around sort of finance and taxation and so on. And I just wondered what discussion has happened or in the area of how council tax is or isn't used to either incentivise or fund climate related action. And is there any discussion of that locally that you're aware of? Is that, I mean, yeah, strikes me as a sort of important area.
Hi, Sally. It's a great question. I would like to know the answer to that too. I think we might have someone from the council on here, but don't know if they want to answer. But just to reiterate that the issue of how we finance a just transition is really important, and ideally it's done progressively and in a progressive way. Reforming council tax bans could be one of those. Does anyone else want to say something about that?
Well, I could just feed in. All our 6 councils do have a climate budget, but that varies from in the millions for Oxfordshire, Oxford City rather, where a lot of it's going into capital work, down to around 70,000 for one of the districts, which is really just going to employ a couple of staff. So it is very variable. We are doing a report on what all 6 Oxfordshire councils have done since they declared a climate emergency, and that will be out in the next few weeks, couple of weeks. Any more questions for Zarina? I can't see.
Chris,
Yep.
Chris, can I respond to Philippa's
Please do.
comment?
Yeah,
Right,
please do.
okay, because I hear this quite a lot, right? And there's 2 things that need to shift, right? It's the approach. So the approach is about you wanting somebody to engage with to meet your targets, right? And your outcomes, right? So that doesn't work, right? Because why should another organization invest time to meet your targets, right? So you need to think of how do you work with other communities where they also benefit and are also co-benefiting from your work. So thinking about approaching it from a different angle. There's an assumption that organizations have time and resources to attend additional meetings because you want them to be there and you're giving them the space to be there. So that's not always the case either. They don't have the time and resources. So if you can help with some of that, maybe even say, right, okay, there's a paid position to be on a stakeholder working group, or we can recompensate you, you know, and pay some small fee for you to be there. That could be helpful. So it's, and then also thinking about going back to what Ruth was saying about core benefits as well. So start with where they're at, what are their needs, what are they looking out for, and then working backwards and seeing how does that fit into your agenda or the green agenda is another way that's quite helpful.
Thanks, Zarina.
Thank you. Yes, I mean, we're engaging with ethnic minority associations that want to create more environmental action in Oxfordshire. So it is, our aims are completely aligned, and it's still proving difficult. So
okay. Yeah. Unless there's any more specific questions for Zarina, which I'm not seeing, I'd like to ask you all just to go into groups for 10 minutes. We're going to overrun by about 5 minutes. I hope that's okay. And just reflect on these 3 points. What can my organisation do to help create a fairer and more diverse movement? What can we do together? And bear in mind, we've already talked about the great big Green Week in September and lots of activities then. And what support would we need? I hope people are prepared to think about this. We are going to put you all into breakout rooms of, I think there'll be something like 4 or 5 people in each room. So a chat, if you, we're not going to ask everyone to report back because we won't have time. But if your group does come up with a good idea, please do share it. And if someone could take notes and pass them back to us, I will put an email to send them to in the chat room. But I'm going to ask you just to think, what have you heard today? What's the impact of what you've heard today? And what could you do? So off you go. Hi, sorry, just to butt in, Zarina, I didn't intend to put you in a group.
All right.
Do you want to, do you want to leave or?
I'm quite happy being in a group.
Oh, well, okay, well, fine.
Right.
If people are okay with that.
Yeah.
Bonus.
Oh. Absolutely.
Okay, off you go. I will leave.